going to be didactic on
I
bacterial
can
infections.
introduce the speakers because some of them you may not know. I'm happy to introduce them if you want.
I got the details, but I'm just seeing your screen. That's why I'm a little confused. That's
no. I was just going to give a little overview of what we're going to do today.
Okay, then okay,
Two
fine,
or three slides and introduce the speakers, and then hand over to Ram.
Sure. That sounds good. So I think we'll start then. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for logging in for the weekly online teaching session, which is run for the Pediatric Hematology Oncology Fellows. So first of all, I should, on behalf of the Hematology Oncology chapter, thank Dr. Revati Raj for moderating today's session and volunteering for doing the topic today. Ma'am doesn't need an introduction. We know she's a senior consultant head of Pediatric Hematology Oncology at Apollo Hospitals, Chennai. So we'll be basically having the same schema for today as well. So there'll be didactic first, which is going to be on very relevant topic, and that is management of drug resistant bacterial infections in immunocompromised children. And we have a very esteemed faculty today. Dr. Revati is probably going to introduce in a better way later on. But thank you, Dr. Ram Gopalakrishnan, who is a senior consultant of infectious disease at Apollo Chennai, for agreeing and participating in today's session with us. So welcome to you, sir. We also have our own hematology oncology colleagues. We have got Dr. Venkat from Adiyar Cancer Hospital. We know he's a professor there. Siddharth, who is also assistant professor at CMC Vellore. And we have Ramya, Dr. Ramya, who is a consultant hematology oncology at Apollo Hospital, Chennai. Dr. Kesman is the fellow who is going to present the cases today. So thank you, Echo and Ria, for our technical support and the and the platform, and again to the program committee, especially Neeta and Anand, who kind of put together these sessions week on, week off. So over to you, Dr. Revati, for the next 1.5 hours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sunil, and to the PHO chapter for the opportunity. When we had to choose a topic for discussion, I thought for new postgraduates and fellows in training, what would be the most challenging condition we treat? And I couldn't think of anything other than AML. And managing a child with AML actually reminds you perfectly of what Saint Francis of Assisi said, especially in recent times with so many challenges that we've had to treat a child with AML. And it goes by saying you start by doing what is necessary, then the next thing you're doing what is possible, and suddenly you're doing what is impossible. And AML treatment in children actually personifies all of these stages. Once you get them out of the hospital, you have this enormous sense of satisfaction. There is very little data coming from our country, and this is the big publication from CMC Vellore to say that AML in children, the children do better than adults, but it's still nowhere as near as what is happening in the Western countries. We've come a long way with AML from just looking down the microscope to say last. We've now gone over to flow signals and molecular markers. So everything tells us how we treat AML and MRD-based treatment as well. We've come a long way in supportive care, and we know how to make sure we can bridge the gap for completing treatments for children. So today's session we have, as Sunil said, some of the best in the field of pediatric hem-onc and ID, and Dr. Ram Gopalakrishnan is a very good friend, and I think an example of how science can really make a difference to the community, and they are doing a beautiful service in the state and in our city for COVID patients. But also Ram has this experience in antibiotic resistant bacterial infections, which he's going to share with us, and they run a good training program, and so many units have benefited by his training. Dr. Keshavan, who's our fellow, will be presenting 2 cases of AML. And today we want to focus on, once we diagnose a child with AML, how do we risk stratify? Whom are we going to treat with just chemotherapy? Whom are we going to transplant? Whom do we think on day 1 is going to relapse, or who's going to do well? What are the principles, and how to provide the supportive care? And for that, I have my team of panelists, Dr. Venkat, who's from Cancer Institute, Adyar, and he's a great teacher and he's good fun. We've been doing a lot of sessions with the Tamil Nadu Pediatric Oncology Group as well. And Dr. Siddharth, he's very unique, Siddharth's position, because he's worked in units all around the country, right from Chandigarh to Vellore to Chennai. So his sharing his experience will be very valuable here. And my very own partner in crime, Dr. Ramya, who's done a lot of work on AML infections. So I hope you will all benefit from the session. And without much ado, I'll hand over the floor to Ram for his didactic on antibiotic-resistant bacterial infections.
Okay, thank you very much, Revati. I hope all of you can hear me well and see me as well. Is the acoustics okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir, it's perfect.
Thank you. So thanks, Revati, for offering to forward my slides. So this is what I'll roughly cover. I agree that in 20 minutes it's going to be difficult to cover all of these. And Revati specifically asked me to focus on Klebsiella, so I'll spend a little bit more time there, and we can take up the rest in questions. Next slide. So this is a basic schema of carbapenemases, if you will, or beta-lactamases in general. Now, all this stuff was completely irrelevant till about 4 or 5 years back, but it's important to know this now because the therapy we use depends on whether you understand this classification of beta-lactamases. In class B is what you have, the famous Indian one, the one that came from Delhi, New Delhi metallo-beta-lactamase. And in class A are the others that we commonly see, such as ESBLs, KPCs, which aren't very common in India. And in class D are the OXA enzymes. Now, as I said, therapy is based upon knowledge of this classification, because the drug you pick, you need to know which class your enzymes or the likely mechanism of resistance. So it's worthwhile kind of remembering this because every time you need to apply this on a patient. Next slide. So some general principles in the treatment of MDROs. The first issue is in a neutropenic child, you really need to know what the bug is and what it's sensitive to ASAP. It goes without saying. So you need to use certain modern techniques that we have available. You can't wait for your blood cultures to grow. You need to start therapy early. As soon as you draw your blood cultures, give your antibiotic. That is critical. Know the exact molecular mechanism of resistance. This has again changed in the last few years. It doesn't help just saying it's carbapenem resistant. You need to know how. You need to kind of fiddle around with your drug doses so that you can optimize your chances of killing the bugs. Sometimes you need combination therapy, and obviously helps if you can get that neutrophil count back up. Easier said than done. Next slide. This is a schema for blood cultures, and I must repeat, the most important thing and the most common error I see in practice is physicians don't draw enough volumes of blood for culture. If your patient isn't anemic from the AML itself, you better make that patient anemic from the blood cultures you draw, because it's critical to have something growing in blood. You draw lots of blood cultures, there'll be lots of rewards in terms of correction of sepsis. So you draw blood, day 1, the lab calls saying that it's growing gram negatives or gram positives. Day 2, they tell you what it is. Day 3, they tell you sensitivities. And if you got your antibiotics on board correctly, you're lucky. But if you wait for day 3, then you're obviously wrong. On the bottom slide or bottom part of the slide are the newer techniques that we use. We can rapidly identify it using a machine called MALDI-TOF, and we can use molecular methods to figure out whether that bug is carbapenem resistant, and if so, what is the correct antibiotic you can pick and choose. All of this is readily available. Next slide. So molecular diagnosis of bloodstream infections really should be standard of care in a modern hematology oncology unit if you're treating AML, doing allotransplants, etc. You can see that in this meta-analysis, if you did this test on 20 patients, you would save 1 life. So how do we actually use these tests in practice? Next slide. So these are the two techniques in red which we have available at Apollo where I practice. Every time a blood culture flags, by evening, if you talk to your lab, they can tell you what it is. They can tell you whether it is Salmonella, easy to treat, or whether it's Pseudomonas or that bug from hell, which is Klebsiella. So you need to know that info before you leave for the day. Secondly, at the bottom is what we call this Carba-R test. I'll show you some more data on it, which tells you whether your bug is carbapenem resistant, and if so, what is the mechanism of resistance. There are many tests available in the market. I've just marked out what we do at Apollo. But going back to bread and butter principles, how are you going to pick your antibiotic, your empiric antibiotics? Now, this is a 2017 antibiogram, but you can see that as far as 3 years ago, about 36% of our Klebsiellas were carbapenemase producers, which means that if I suspect sepsis for a hospital-acquired infection, or if Klebsiella is likely, there's a 1 in 3 chance that my carbapenem won't work. So I should start off with a carbapenem-resistant coverage empirically. So it's critical for all your hospitals to have their own antibiogram so you can devise your appropriate empiric antibiotic therapy and modify accordingly. Next slide. We'll start off on ESBL producing Enterobacteriaceae. Now, much of this is old hat. Next slide. But what is new in this field? We all know what ESBLs are. They've been around for the last 30 to 40 years. That's why you never use ceftazidime anymore for empiric therapy of febrile neutropenia. Next slide. Now, the conventional teaching on, next slide. The conventional teaching on ESBL sepsis is that carbapenems are the surest agents for therapy. However, we try to get away with BLIs like piptazo, cefoperazone, sulbactam, etc. Is that appropriate? Next slide. To address this question, a large trial, next slide, called the Merino trial was published a couple of years back, which clearly shows that your mortality is about 12% if you use piptaz, whereas it was 3% if you use carbapenems. Next slide. So the take-home point from this very first randomized controlled trial is that if you have an ESBL bacteremia, especially in a neutropenic patient, please stick with the carbapenem. Do not use piptaz, and for the same reason, do not use cefosol. You can see here that in some sub-analysis, such as a UTI source, the BLBLI did as well. But in general, you're better off with the carbapenem, especially in an immune-compromised host. Next slide. Now, there are some situations where you can get away with piptaz, but the reason why piptaz failed is there are some oxacillinases which your antibiogram does not detect. In other words, even if you get piptaz sensitivity on your antibiogram, you may have clinical failure. So, especially in a neutropenic host, I would advise you to use carbapenems if your blood cultures grow ESBL. Next slide. There are some caveats to this. Now, in some patients with urosepsis, for instance, you could get away with piptaz or cefosol. Next slide. But if you have bacteremia and neutropenia, that is a deadly combination. For instance, non-bacteremic ESBL pyelonephritis, fine. Urosepsis, fine. But severely ill patients, blood cultures positive, neutropenia, please use carbapenems, right? So we've generally moved away from BLBLIs for bacteremias, kind of reserve them for non-bacteremic infections, less severely infections, urosepsis, etc. Next slide. Right. So moving on to carbapenem-resistant GNB, which I'm sure is a big bugbear in transplantation. Now, traditionally, the big bad boy of transplant and of febrile neutropenia has been Pseudomonas. All our therapies have always included anti-Pseudomonal therapy. However, in India, actually, Pseudomonas is often much more sensitive than Klebsiella. And so I agree, you need to use anti-Pseudomonal drug. You certainly can't get away with a non-Pseudomonal therapy. But the resistance is not an issue here. Next slide. One important principle that you need to know is that Pseudomonas is resistant to carbapenems, not just by carbapenemase production, but by multiple other mechanisms. It can kick the antibiotic out of the cell. It can actually increase its efflux. It can affect porin channels so the drug doesn't get in. So looking for carbapenemases on your test does not predict that your bug will be sensitive. That is very important. Carbapenem does it all. Pseudomonas does it all, not just carbapenemases, but other mechanisms of resistance. So using specific resistance mechanisms to decide your drug is really not applicable for Pseudomonas. This is an important principle which you need to keep in mind. Next slide. So we don't have actually a randomized controlled trial as to what is the best therapy for Pseudomonas infections. We were always taught you need to combine a beta-lactam with an aminoglycoside, 2-drug therapy. That's what we were all trained on. However, there's been a lot of advances in this field. Next slide. And to summarize a big volume of data, if the Pseudomonas in your practice is sensitive, if you have good sensitivity, 70 to 80%, just use a beta-lactam. That could be cefosalb, it could be piptaz, it could be carbapenem, whatever. On the other hand, if you're seeing a lot of resistant Pseudomonas, then you're better off using 2 drugs just to make sure that at least one is sensitive. It could be an aminoglycoside like amikacin, it could be a polymyxin. So you need to know your local antibiogram, but in general, most centers in India don't have a lot of problems with Pseudomonas. And if you've added aminoglycosides in the beginning, you can stop the aminoglycoside after your blood cultures return. So monotherapy is generally the standard of care for Pseudomonas. This is a big departure from how we used to view this bug, say 20, 25 years ago. And you can easily stop that aminoglycoside if your beta-lactam is sensitive. Next slide. Right. Now, if you have a Pseudomonas in blood, which is the best anti-Pseudomonal agent? We have multiple choices, but there is some thought now that there is a greater likelihood of breakthrough resistance and also more collateral damage with carbapenem. So if you're growing Pseudomonas in the blood, stick to either ceftazidime or piptaz, general principle of de-escalating to a narrower spectrum drug to preserve your big guns. The next bug which I'm going to briefly touch on is Acinetobacter. Now, Acinetobacter is not a big problem pathogen in the febrile neutropenic patients, simply because it is an environmental bug. Most AMLs, most people with febrile neutropenia become bacteremic with their own bugs from their own gut flora or through their lines. Now, Acinetobacter does it all. There is no way you can actually predict the mechanism of resistance in Acinetobacter. This is an important point, so that if you do a test for resistance, it does not apply to Acinetobacter as well as Pseudomonas as I described. Now, this is a bit of a busy slide, but it's a very India applicable slide because this is written entirely by Indian authors who looked at the Indian epidemiology of some of the big bugs we're talking about. If you look at Acinetobacter right at the bottom of your slide, you can see here that they are quite multi-drug resistant. But the mechanism of resistance clearly is not just beta-lactamase production. Next slide. Right, and you can see here the mechanisms of resistance in each of these so-called big fours in terms of gram negatives. E. coli, most of them produce so-called NDM1 or metallo-beta-lactamases, to which we don't have effective therapy. Klebs, on the other hand, largely produce what we call OXA48, which largely responds to a particular BLBLI called ceftazidime avibactam. Pseudomonas is much more sensitive. Acinetobacter is resistant to virtually everything except polymyxins. So you need to know the subtle differences between these 4 bugs if you want to plan your therapy early up front. You can't wait for your sensitivity test to come back 2 or 3 days later. You got to get it right up front. So if you're having a multi-drug resistant Acinetobacter, which is quite common in an intensive care setting, a lot of healthcare exposure, a lot of antibiotics, these are the options open to you. You could use carbapenems. Much of the time it won't work, they're just resistant. You could use sulbactam as part of say cefoperazone sulbactam, but most of the time you're going to end up using polymyxins, either polymyxin B or colistin in combination, usually with a second drug such as minocycline. Right. So if you look at meta-analysis, does one drug or do you need 2 drugs for Acinetobacter? Then the answer is very clear. A single drug results in as good clinical cure rates as 2 drugs. So we said 1 drug for Pseudomonas. It is also 1 drug for Acineto. Usually with colistin, the sulbactam really doesn't give you a lot clinically. Next slide. And there is actually good randomized trial data. This is a study where they combined colistin with meropenem versus colistin alone for carbapenem resistant GNBs, largely Acinetobacter. Next slide. And what they found here was that there was no benefit in giving two drugs if your colistin alone worked. So this is again another important take-home point we have learned in the last few years. A single drug is good enough for Acinetobacter. A single drug is good enough for Pseudomonas. If you're using combination therapy, you can de-escalate and knock that second agent off once your sensitivities are back. Next slide. So this is the approach to Acinetobacters. You largely rely on colistin or polymyxin. You could add a second drug, but if your colistin, if your MIC is low, you will usually have good outcomes with Acinetobacter. Next slide. Right. So spending some time on CR, E. coli, and Klebsiella, which is really the bugbear of most febrile neutropenics. Now, most of you know that this is old hat where NDM1 took off, the seminal paper. Next slide. And then they found it in the New Delhi water supply. So don't drink the water in New Delhi if you go there. And this is not exporting, TVs or cell phones. This is exporting NDM1 all over the world. So we are the proud originators of NDM1 now. Next slide. And so what has this led? This has led to greatly increased mortality and morbidity. You can clearly see that if your bug is carbapenem resistant, you're having about a 15% increased mortality, more hospital stay, etc., etc. So clearly these carbapenem resistance matters clinically. And I referred to this old study earlier. Next slide. To kind of simplify this. Next slide. The same slide I showed earlier, the mechanisms of resistance. Next slide. Next slide. So basically what this paper, yes, this is, if you can remember something from this talk, please focus on that one slide, the one just before this. You can see here that if you're dealing with an E. coli, your mechanism of resistance is largely NDM1. Nothing works except aztreonam. If you're dealing with Klebsiella, then largely it's going to be OXA48, the newer BLBLI called ceftazidime avibactam will work. But sometimes they have mixed mechanisms of resistance. So you really need to know this when you're planning therapy in a febrile neutropenic. Next slide. Now, does single drug or does two drug matters for Klebsiella? This is a large randomized controlled trial which shows that if you start two drugs at the same time initially, next slide. In other words, if your empiric therapy in a sick patient was two drugs, then you probably had a higher mortality. So based upon studies like this, randomized controlled trial, the recommendation is if you are suspecting a resistant Klebsiella or E. coli, start with two drugs upfront and then de-escalate if you have a good single agent available in a less severely ill patient. Next slide. And so that is how we approach therapies for these resistant organisms. We typically start off with two drugs. In India, unfortunately, we are forced to add colistin for many of these patients because many of them have E. coli which produce NDM1. Not a lot you can do for NDM1 in terms of beta lactamases, so you're forced to use colistin. Next slide. Right. So this is another important article which you should be aware of if you're using polymyxins. This is a consensus guideline which is endorsed by many societies. Next slide. And essentially what this guideline says that use polymyxin B. Now you should not be using colistin unless your diagnosis polymyxin is not. You could use colistin if you want to use it intrathecally or for nebulization, but for bread and butter systemic use, please go with polymyxin B, easier to dose, no renal dose adjustment, less nephrotoxic. So that your practice should change accordingly. Next slide. So we have switched over to polymyxin B in most of our febrile neutropenic where we do use these drugs. The same paper which I alluded to earlier has now shown you that there are a lot of so-called beta-lactam, beta-lactamase inhibitors in the mix now. So you can kind of make use of these drugs as so-called colistin sparers. Next slide. The most popular among this new group of drugs, in fact, the only one that's available in India is ceftazidime avibactam. You need to know a little bit about this drug because it will help you spare colistin, which is a toxic drug in many of your patients. Next slide. Now, if you're using this drug, you really need to know molecular mechanisms of therapy. Next slide. And how does that work out? Now, this drug has been well studied in a large number of situations for intra-abdominal infections, bacteremias, etc. And I showed you a class C enzyme called OXA48. This effectively inhibits OXA48. Remember, OXA48 is the enzyme that CLEBs produce. So if you know you're treating a CLEB, this is a good drug to use. On the other hand, E. coli produce NDM1. This drug will not work well against E. coli. Next slide. And so how do you figure all this out into your clinical algorithm? Next slide. And so that is what we tried to look at. Next slide. In terms of figuring out what is our best approach. We know it works well for OXA48, but how do you know your patient has OXA48? So we studied about 150 patients and presented this data. What we did was, when the blood culture flagged, we asked for this CARBA-R test looking at a molecular mechanism of resistance. We found that about half our patients had OXA48. Yes, you could use a drug like Cas-Avi. About 32% had NDM1. You're stuck with colistin. And some of them had mixed mechanisms of resistance. And obviously, if they don't have resistance, you're great. You can just get away with your carbapenem therapy. Next slide. So our conclusion in this abstract was that if you have a positive blood culture in a sick patient, please use this test. It'll give you, by the end of the day, before you go home, whether your bug is carbapenem resistant, and if so, what is the drug that will work and won't work against it. This has kind of revolutionized therapy for sick bacteremic patients. Next slide. Who are neutropenic, who are not neutropenic in the ICU, etc. And we strongly recommend that this test be made use of in your flow, approach to flow. You need to know what the bug is, if it's E. coli, Klebsiella, Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter, and then you need to know the CARBA-R result and the mechanism of resistance. You can decide all this by the end of the day, so you can go home and get a good night's rest in a febrile neutropenic. Next slide, which is not always an easy thing to do. Next slide. And therefore, we have just incorporated this test into our algorithm. The same test can be used in stool as a screening test, which will be spoken about later. There's some data on that. Next slide. There is another kind of little trick you can try. Now, aztreonam, we know aztreonam is an old drug. It actually inhibits NDM1. But the problem is all these bugs co-carry ESBLs, which will eat up the aztreonam if you give it alone. Next slide. So can we give the aztreonam in addition to ceftazidime avibactam? Could you do a so-called homemade brew therapy? Yes, in vitro. This study from CMC Vellore suggested you could do that in vitro. Next slide. And I'll show you, you can actually put these two discs or an E-strip and a disc next to each other. And if there's a tiny zone of inhibition between those two discs, there's a good chance that your combination therapy will work. Next slide. So what we do with ceftazidime avibactam is we always add the aztreonam up front. And if you're dealing with NDM1, you have to continue the aztreonam. If you're just dealing with an OXA48, you can knock off the aztreonam and leave this drug alone. Remember, the big gap in the spectrum of this drug is no Acinetobacter coverage. So you can't use it for empiric therapy for hospital-acquired sepsis. You have to use polymyxins too there. Next slide. So one other drug which has been spawned by this carbapenem resistance is fosfomycin. Fosfomycin is a membrane-active drug. So it will not be affected by carbapenemasis. It's not a beta-lactam. So if you're using fosfomycin, this is a good drug for E. coli. Now, most E. colis, it will work against. Most Klebsiellas, it won't work. Intrinsically, no activity against Pseudomonas and Acinetobacter. Next slide. So we do use this drug quite a lot, especially in patients who have kidney issues, right? Because, you know, polymyxin, it's a big problem with kidneys, neurotoxicities, etc. In adults, we use big doses. Correspondingly, high doses would be required in children as a second drug. Most people recommend this as a combination agent. Next slide. So we are using all these drugs other than carbapenems for Klebsiella, but even then, many of these patients would get into trouble. Pull out that line if there is one. Always ask for a molecular mechanism of resistance. Push ceftazidime avibactam with or without aztreonam if you can use it. Add high dose tigecycline. You know, certainly add fosfomycin. So remove the lines. These are all things you can do to treat a nasty MDR Klebsiella in a febrile neutropenic patient. Next slide. Now, unfortunately, you can have bugs which are colistin and carbapenem resistant. The number of C's is just going on and on there. And this is a case series of colistin resistant bugs we recently published. Next slide. What predisposes to colistin resistance? No surprises here. You can see the percentage of patients who got colistin. You give something, your bug is going to get resistance to that. So if you've had somebody who's been exposed to colistin in the past, please think of colistin resistance. And some of these patients got better with fosfomycin, tigecycline, chloramphenicol, all drugs that we took off the shelf and we are recycling. Next slide. And in this situation, it's certainly, next slide, it's certainly a good idea to call your friendly ID consultant for his help or her help. Next slide. And in order to improve outcomes in these pretty sick patients. Next slide. I think I have only a couple of slides left. Next slide. Right. So in all these MDR infections, decide whether you need to treat or not. If it's not from the bug, perhaps you don't need to treat. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Try to use sulbactam for Acinetobacter, Pseudomonas, single drug, E. coli, Klebs. Try to use this new drug called Cazavi with Aztreonam, and obviously prayer would help in these resistant infections. Next slide. Okay, thank you very much. That's all I have for you. Back to you, Revati. I'll be happy to take any questions at any point later if you want, whenever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ram. I think you have covered quite a lot in 25 minutes, and also thank you for agreeing to stay back so that if people have questions and they can put it on the chat box, and if you can continue answering them. I love the way every slide of yours said pray. I think that last bit which said pray in red is what we normally do, but actually there is science behind what we do, and science is helping us, guiding us with the treatment. And as you rightly said, if we do the right cultures and we know what bug we are dealing with, then at least we have something to offer for these children. So having set the stage with what kind of infections we are dealing with, AML, as Ram said, is peculiar. Most of the infections are coming from the child's own body and our gut, which is laden with bacteria. In the West, they're seeing quite a lot of drug-resistant bacteria, but they're all mostly gram-positive. What we are seeing here is gram-negative. So here we definitely need help with the ID inputs and a good hospital infection control. So I'm now going to request Dr. Keshavan, our fellow, to do his case presentation to highlight what was the journey of two of our patients with the challenges we faced with risk stratification and with infections. Over to you, Keshav.
Good evening to one and all present here. I'll be presenting on two cases in AML. So moving on to case one, it's a 14-year-old male who is a second-born child of a non-consanguineous marriage from Guwahati, who presented to us in October 2016 with complaints of fever on and off for the past 2 weeks, low grade, no chills and rigors, giddiness and tiredness for 2 weeks. He was evaluated in a local hospital, found to be pancytopenic. He was stabilized with blood transfusion and referred here for further management. On examination, he was found to be, he was conscious, afebrile, and he was pale, vitals were stable, oral cavity was normal, no organomegaly, no lymphadenopathy, weight was 51 kg, which was between 50 and 75th centile, systemic examination was normal. So on doing investigation, we found him to be pancytopenic. Hemoglobin was 5.7, WBC count was 3,300, platelet count was 9,000 with blasts present in the peripheral smear. Renal function test, liver function test, serum electrolytes, all were within normal limits. Uric acid was 3.5 milligram per deciliter. LDH was 450 international units per ml. And we sent a stool for expert Carba-R, where NDM and OXA48 were detected. Bone marrow examination was done, which was suggestive of acute myeloid leukemia. Flow cytometry showed features with aberrant CD19 expression with CD34, CD33, CD15, CD117 was found to be positive. FISH was positive for translocation 821. CSF analysis was clear. FLT3 ITD was negative. So we diagnosed him as an acute myeloid leukemia, AML M2 with FLT3 negativity. He was started on induction chemotherapy as per UK MRC AML 17 protocol. which had cytarabine, daunorubicin, and etoposide, ADE regimen. And on prophylaxis, we gave him acyclovir, micafungin, and trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole twice a week. He tolerated the conditioning chemotherapy well without any complications. On day +5 of the post-chemotherapy, he started developing new onset fever spikes. And after taking blood cultures, he was started on cefoperazone sulbactam as per a hospital policy. He had persistent of fever spikes. Cultures were sent. 2 cultures were sent, one from the central line and from the peripheral line. Both were negative. There was no focus of infection. In view of persistent fever spikes, antibiotics were upscaled to meropenem and colistin. Antifungal was changed to amphotericin B. On day 12 of post-chemotherapy, he had a fever spike with blood cultures growing, ESBL positive Klebsiella pneumonia, which was sensitive to colistin, tigecycline, and fosfomycin. His central line was removed, and antibiotics were changed as per sensitivity. During that same period, further imaging were done. HRCT chest was done, which was normal. Ultrasound abdomen was normal. CT abdomen showed features of neutrophilic colitis. He had developed during that time period disproportionate tachycardia, requiring fluid bolus and inotrope support. He also received, in view of prolonged profound neutropenia with a resistant bacteria, he received 1 unit of granulocyte infusion during that period. And with the onset of count recovery, his fever settled, but he developed loose stools during the 3rd week post-chemotherapy. And stool for C. diff toxin was found to be positive. And he received oral vancomycin for the same. And on his count recovery, he was found to be in morphological remission with normal trilineage hematopoiesis, no increase in blasts, and MRD was negative, and CSF was clear. Next slide, ma'am. Just slides moving.
One second. Yeah, 1 second. My slides are just getting stuck. Yeah.
Next slide, ma'am. So his end of induction assessment was normal, and he was on OP follow-up. He continued to have fever spikes during this time. His complete blood count was normal. So whole body PET CT was done during that time, and which was suggestive of multiple enlarged nodes, peripancreatic, para-aortic, aortocaval, mesenteric lymph nodes were enlarged. He underwent ultrasound-guided biopsy for the same, and there were features of granuloma was present, and he was started on 4-drug ADT. And on further follow-up, he completed the next slide, ma'am. He completed the 2nd cycle of ADE, and followed by he received 2 courses of consolidation therapy with high-dose cytarabine. Completed his treatment in March 2017, and he is in remission. Moving on to the second case, it's a 15-year-old girl, born of a non-consanguineous marriage, only child, who presented to us in July 2019, who had complaints of fever for 2 weeks, which was intermittent, no chills and rigors. Giddiness was present for 2 weeks, and there was no other complaints. She was evaluated in an outside hospital, found to be severe pallor was present. She received blood transfusion there and was referred here for further management. On examination, she was conscious, afebrile, pallor was present, oral cavity was normal, systemic examination was normal, no organomegaly, no lymphadenopathy. Local examination, she had a tag in the perianal region. Otherwise, her examination was normal, and her anthropometry was also normal. Investigation showed hemoglobin of 4.1, total count of 7,700 with a platelet count of 53,000, and blasts were present in the peripheral smear. The renal function test and the liver function test and serum electrolytes were normal. Uric acid was 4.2, LDH was 530, and the stool for expert carba-R showed NDM and OXA48 was detected. Bone marrow examination showed the presence of acute myeloid leukemia, suggestive of AML-M2. FLT3 ITD was positive, and the karyotyping was found to be positive for translocation 3-5, Q21, Q31 in most of the metaphases analyzed. And this is the flow cytometry, which confirmed the diagnosis of acute myeloid leukemia with the HLA-DR, CD38, CD13, and CD33 to be positive. And she started treatment as per UK MRC AML17 protocol. ADE regimen was given. She received cytarabine, daunorubicin, etoposide with prophylaxis of acyclovir, micafungin, and trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole twice a week. She tolerated the conditioning chemotherapy well, but on day +1 of she started developing fever spikes, and after taking blood cultures, she was started on cefoperazone sulbactam. On day +2, she developed disproportionate tachycardia, which required fluid bolus. In view of disproportionate tachycardia, central line was removed and cultures were taken, and antibiotics were upscaled to meropenem and colistin. Her cultures were sterile, and after 48 hours, fever spikes settled, hemodynamics was stable, and her antibiotics were downscaled. On day +6, day +7 of post chemotherapy, she started developing new onset of cough, running nose was present, chest on auscultation was clear, nasopharyngeal swab was done, which was identified to have rhinovirus or enteroviral infection, and she received oseltamivir for the same. CT chest showed multiple nodules with peripheral ground gas haziness in both the lungs. It was possibly an angioinvasive aspergillosis. Antifungal were changed to amphotericin at 3 mg per kg per day. On day +8, she started developing high-grade fever spikes. She also had a focus. Her perineal tag had a boil with a cut in the region. Blood cultures were sent, but she was having continuous fever spikes. The culture grew no growth. She had a profound neutropenia with a perineal focus and infective etiology in the chest. She received a granulocyte transfusion, and her symptoms settled with the onset of count recovery. And she was assessed after count recovery. Bone marrow was in morphological remission. MRD was 2.86%. CSF was clear. So the parents were counseled that the child will need to bring into remission induction, followed by consolidation with a transplant, as she was a high-risk patient with a FLT3 ITD positive, and end of induction MRD was positive. She received salvage chemotherapy with a flag and bortezomib chemotherapy. During day +10, she had similar episode of febrile neutropenia with a cut in the perineal region. Here, blood cultures grew Klebsiella pneumonia, which was carbapenem resistant and sensitive to colistin and fosfomycin. Her central line was removed and antibiotics were changed accordingly. She received a granulocyte transfusion during this course of admission also. And with the onset of count recovery, her symptoms settled. On follow-up, bone marrow examination was done, which was normal in morphological remission. MRD was negative, CSF was normal. She underwent transplant from a matched unrelated donor, 10-patent donor in October 2019. Currently, she's 10 to 11 months post-transplant with features of skin and mouth GVHD. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, so these two, thank you, Keshav. That was quite two long stories, and just a recap. I think this story is not something that our group has not seen. So this is something we see every day. AML is one condition where we have prolonged profound neutropenia. So we have challenges with bacterial infection and fungal infection and the hospital acquired bugs. And that is the story you've seen in these two cases. So we're going to have our panel discussion focused on two different aspects. The first one, when you see a child with AML, how are you going to risk stratify them? What chemotherapy are you going to give? Are you going to recommend transplantation? And then second, the second part is how are you going to provide the supportive care with specific reference to bacterial infections and some of the peculiar infections. So if I go back to the first patient, you know, sometimes we don't have to wait for the FISH and karyotyping results to come back. So aberrant CD19 was a clue in the first child that the cytogenetics are going to be 821 translocation. So you feel that your child is going to do well, and then bang, you get stuck with the resistant bacteria, and then you start worrying, is he going to make it through the chemotherapy or not? So I want to request Dr. Venkat to talk to us about how he would go about risk stratifying children, a new diagnosis, AML. How are we going to say who needs chemotherapy, who needs higher dose chemotherapy, when will you use salvage, and when will you recommend transplant?
Thank you, Revati Madam, for this opportunity, and thank you, Sunil and the PHO team. Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yeah, it's okay. Today I'm going to talk to you about risk stratification in AML and pediatric AML. It is important to risk stratify because we need to prognosticate to know whether the child is going to do well or not, and also to plan our treatment in terms of transplant or not in the first remission. So in adults, there is a lot of data which has clearly shown that if you have a low risk disease, you tend to do better than patients who have an intermediate risk and high risk disease. But what about children? Does risk stratification in children have the same impact as in adults? And yes, it does. This is data from our own center about a decade back when we were not transplanting and the children were not being even salvaged at relapse. And you can see that those who had the good risk factors had almost a 60% survival. And if you had a poor risk factor, it was all about 10 to 15%. And in between, you did had a survival of about 30 to 40%. So it does make a difference in terms of outcomes in children. So the next question is, how do you risk stratify? And unlike ALL, risk stratification in children with AML is mainly based on your cytogenetics and molecular abnormalities. So you can risk stratify at diagnosis or at the end of induction. So the methods used at diagnosis include your conventional cytogenetics, or you can use the FISH, which is fluorescent in situ hybridization, and you can detect genetic mutations using next generation sequencing or PCR methods. Not one method is enough to risk stratify or find abnormalities. You need to use a combination of either cytogenetics or FISH with your molecular methods to risk stratify. And like in ALL, risk stratification after induction is based on minimal residual disease, which can again be done by flow cytometry, PCR, or NGS. I'll talk to you about the role of cytogenetics in risk stratification. So commonly in AML, you can either get deletions as seen in the flush slide, or you can get inversions where the genes are inversed. You can have translocations, you can have trisomy like here, trisomy 21, or you can have a loss of chromosome called monosomy. So these are the common abnormalities which are seen. And this is a classical FISH for a T821. Where the a part of 8 chromosome gets translocated with the part of chromosome 21. Here. So it's called the derivative 8 and derivative 21. And this is a FISH where we use a probe, one yellow color probe for the AML gene on chromosome 8 and a red color probe for ETO gene on chromosome 21. So they should appear separately. When there is fusion, you can see a combined yellow and red together. So that is the classical appearance on the FISH. So here 821 has been diagnosed both on your cytogenetics as well as on FISH. Sometimes FISH is more sensitive to pick up translocations which are not clearly seen on your karyotypes. So in adults, the cytogenetics and the molecular abnormalities are classified according to the European Leukemia Network classification into favorable, intermediate, and adverse risk groups. This was been modified. The previous one was, I think, 2011. It had intermediate 1 and intermediate 2, and that has been combined into a single group. So this slide is quite busy, but I'll keep on explaining as we go ahead. So remember, there is the favorable group or the good risk, the intermediate group, and the adverse risk group. FLT3 is something which we will continue to hear throughout the talk. And I'm putting this here because that FLT3 mutation, FLT is nothing but a gene called the FMS-like tyrosine kinase gene. It has two types of abnormalities. One is called an internal tandem duplication, where the gene is repeated again and again. And second one is a mutation in the gene itself, which is called as a tyrosine kinase domain mutation. So when you're talking about FLT3 for risk stratification, it's always the ITD. The tyrosine kinase domain mutations do not impact risk stratification in AML. So if you get an FLT3 TKD report, you need not worry. And again, you should at least have an allelic ratio of 0.5 for the FLT3 ITD to be significant. So please bear this in mind. So this is even more complex. This slide looks at pediatric patients and their common abnormalities and their risk stratification. So the previous ELN was for the adult patients. This is from the pediatric patients. This is from the article called How I Treat Pediatric AML. Just look at it. The T821 is commonly seen in 15% of patients. The second one, inversion 16 in 10%. Both of them are good risk AML. They're also called as core binding factor leukemia. So this is about 25%. FLT3 ITD, which is the bad, is seen in about 12%. Monosomy 7, which is also bad, is seen in 1. And there are a scope of other mutations, which are like the MLL gene rearrangement seen in 20%. You have the NPM mutations, EBP mutations, which people really don't know what's its impact in children. Again, people have tried correlating the type of AML with the abnormality. So you can get T122 or chromosome abnormality 3 in AML M7. The classical T821 is reported in AML M2. Patients tend to have proptosis also. Your deletion 7, -7 can also be seen in therapy-related AMLs. And your 11q23 or MLL is classically seen in infants, which has poor prognosis and associated with AML M4 or M5. Now the middle group or normal, sometimes we get a report that, there is no cytogenetics abnormalities. It is only 46XX or 46XY, and you're in a conundrum what to do next. This group is actually quite less in children. Only about 15 to 30% of children, unlike about half the adults, have a normal karyotype. But in such patients, you need to go and look at any other abnormalities are present or not. So if you have an FLT3 ITD, that becomes bad. And that is seen in about 20 to 25% of children with a normal karyotype. If you have an MLL gene, it also becomes bad. That's seen in about 1 to 2%. If you have an NPM1 gene abnormalities or mutation, NPM1 stands for nucleophosphamine 1, then it's good. And that's seen in about 25 to 30% of patients. So all in all, about half the patients with normal cytogenetics in pediatrics will also have a molecular abnormality. So that's the reason why I said in addition to doing... Hello. Hello.
Riya, can we mute everyone except for Venkat, please?
Hello. Hello.
You can just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I've done that. Sorry. So again, for residents and fellows, it's very confusing. My slides are not moving. Just a second. Can I share it again? My slides are not moving.
Sure, so you can just share it again.
Yeah, I'm just sharing it again.
You'll have to stop the screen.
Yeah, I got it. So for residents and the fellows, it's very confusing. What is this NPM? What is this FLT3? And what do I do? It's quite simple. Either you can have a positive NPM or a negative NPM, or a positive FLT3 ITD or negative FLT3 ITD. And just remember this. So if you have a NPM positive and a negative, that is a mutated NPM1 with a wild type FLT3, you're in a good group. If you have a wild type NPM1 with a mutated FLT3, you're in the bad group. If in anything in between, that is, if you're both negative or both positive, then you are in the intermediate group. So this is this. So the top one will go into the good prognosis. The middle one will be in the intermediate risk group, and the bottom one, that is NPM1 negative and FLT3 mutated, will go into the poor risk group or high risk group. Another common question is, what are core binding factor leukemias? Core binding factor leukemias are nothing but your T821 and inversion 16. They are associated with good prognosis. They are called core binding factors because of the CBF alpha gene located in 21 chromosome and beta gene in chromosome 16, which are associated with your 821 and inversion 16. These are very excessively sensitive to chemotherapy. You have CR rates as high as 85 to 90%. And as shown in my first slide, that they have very good survival as well. However, you can still have a CBF leukemia and end up being in an intermediate group if you have a KIT mutation. Unfortunately, we don't know what is the relevance of KIT mutation in children, but in adults, presence of a KIT mutation with a CBF leukemia makes you in the intermediate risk group. Another important thing which you should remember about CBF leukemia is that if you have a CBF leukemia and you have other abnormalities, like you might have MLL gene involved and an FLT3 positivity, usually the CBF overrules all the other genetic abnormalities, so you still would remain in the good risk group. For example, APML, 90 to 95% of APML will have an FLT3 mutation, but we know that APMLs tend to do better than others. So we have to look at in toto. Just because somebody is FLT3 positive, but if he has a T821, the T821 trumps FLT3. but this is not seen with your KIT mutations. So these are the two classical 821 and inversion 16. 821 tends to occur with M2, inversion 16 more commonly with M4 with eosinophilia. 821 at relapse tend to do worse than inversion 16 in a relapse. They can be salvaged easily. The inversion 16s tend to present with high white blood cell counts, and usually they do not are not associated with other cytogenetic abnormalities, whereas about 70% of 821s will have other cytogenetic abnormalities, as mentioned here. The next one is complex karyotype. What is complex karyotype? Now, this is not like ALL where you have, multiple copies of hyperdiploides. Here, presence of 3 or more. In some trials, they've taken as 5, but I would say it's 3 or more cytogenetic abnormalities in the same patient would make it complex. And when you have a complex karyotype, you automatically become a high-risk ALL. But again, going back to the initial rule, if you have a core binding factor leukemia like T821 and inversion 16, or if you have APML, or if you have an MLL gene translocation and the two others T69 and inversion 3, then your complex karyotype doesn't come into play. Anyway, 69 and inversion 3s are associated with poor prognosis. So just to revise, first thing you do is get your cytogenetics report and classify the patient as good risk, intermediate risk, or poor risk. Your CBF leukemias are good risk. Your poor leukemias are complex, that is more than 3, 6, 9, 6, 11, 11, 19, anything which has 5 or 7 chromosome knocked out or deleted. Others, all normal cytogenetics, all fall in the middle basket. The second step is, if you have a, as I said, KIT mutation with CBF, you come to the intermediate risk group. If you have a normal karyotype, then go ahead and look at your other molecular markers. If you have a normal karyotype with a mutated NPM, you're in the good risk group. If you have a normal karyotype with a mutated FLT3 and a normal NPM, becomes poor risk group. And there are a host of other genes like RUNX1, ASLX1, P53. These have been described in adults to be associated with poor prognosis, but we don't know what effect it has on children. Same with Wilms tumor type 1. Again, a whole lot of case reports about multiple genetic abnormalities, which really nobody knows. You can't do a randomized trial on them. So we don't know what these abnormalities, in which risk group they come. I'm not talking about this because Siddharth is planning to. What I would say is that adult and children are different. Children tend to have more FLT3 and NRAS and KRAS mutations, which are associated with poor prognosis. So this is again our own data. You could see that, you know, this high risk, intermediate, good risk is almost about 20-25%, about 1/3. So about 1/3 of patients in AML tend to be good risk, 1/3 intermediate risk, and 1/3 at high risk. Coming on to the last part of my talk, which is MRD in AML. This is the new kid on the block. Almost a decade, nobody even bothered about doing MRDs, but now everybody's bitten by the bug. But we really don't know how to do MRD in AML, in the sense that it's not well defined. But studies have shown that if you have an MRD of more than 1% by flow cytometry after first induction, and anything about 0.1% after the second induction, then you have a high risk of relapse. And an MRD value of less than 0.1%, this is unlike 0.01%, which we take in ALL, is considered negative, but you still need to have at least 1 million events to diagnose MRD in children by flow. Again, to bring a twist, as I said, the core binding factor leukemias are the good ones, the T821 and inversion 16s, and generally the MRD clearance in these patients is very slow. So if you have a CBF leukemia with positive MRD after first cycle, but they become negative after the second induction, they still tend to be in the good risk group. So in the CBF leukemias, MRD clearance can be delayed, and that usually does not have a prognostic implication. The next question is, do you do MRD in peripheral blood or bone marrow? The recommendations are to do in both because you get more yield in the bone marrow than peripheral blood. But there is a lot of background noise in bone marrow which can confuse you with your MRD detection. Another thing is that, as I said, there are multiple mutations like FLT3, NPM1, DNMT, ASXL. Now, can we use them to, at the end of induction to do our MRD testing? Maybe yes, maybe no, because some of these mutations are normally seen in the normal population. And also some patients continue to harbor these mutations for years after their remission. So we really don't know the impact of assessing molecular markers for MRD after completion of treatment. So the MRD detection by flow cytometry continues to remain the standard. So this is a proposed risk stratification. So as I said, you divide them into 3 groups: good, bad, and the ugly. Do an MRD. If you continue to remain MRD in the good risk group, you continue to be low risk or good risk. If not, if you're MRD positive, you become intermediate risk. If you're in the intermediate risk group, if you're MRD negative, you continue in the intermediate risk group. If you become positive, then you go on to the high risk group. High risk, whatever the MRD be, you continue to treat them as high risk. You'd never de-escalate patients' AML treatment just based on their MRD currently. To make matters worse, the British have come with their My Child 1 AML 1 protocol, where again they've used MRD cutoffs based on the first and second induction. So they divide the patients into 3 groups: standard, intermediate, and high risk. So if you are good risk cytogenetics upfront, irrespective of your MRD in course 1, if you become MRD negative in course 2, you are still continue to be the same. If you are in the intermediate risk group and you become MRD negative after the first and second course, that is less than 0.1%, you actually become good risk. For the intermediate risk, if you continue to be positive, you become go into the high risk group. So basically, people are still doing mix and match, trying to find out what are the cutoffs, when to do MRD, how to do MRD. All of these are under clinical trial. So I would say use MRD, but be cautious because we really don't know how it impacts. And cytogenetics and your molecular classification trumps whatever is available. This paper is not yet published, the AML 0531 trial, which said that, initially when you classify patient as low risk, standard risk, and high risk, that is good enough. But after induction, you can further divide it into MRD negative and MRD positive into 2 groups. Again, again, the patients who are MRD negative do better than MRD positive. And based on them, I think it's become even more complicated. We have multiple genes, multiple chromosomes, multiple molecular alterations. So by the time I give this talk in another 2 years, I'm sure this will have another 50 or 100 genes and mutations added to it. So to conclude, what I would say is, for the fellows and residents, always ask for a simple karyotype or FISH. Ask for the basic molecular markers which currently have an impact, which includes your FLT3, your MPM1, c-KIT, and CEBPA. Sit down and risk classify your patients at beginning, and at the end of induction, do an MRD. You can probably do an MRD after the end of next induction also, but there is currently no data to alter your treatment. Probably you can decide on transplanting patients or MRD positive. But again, if you have a core binding factor leukemia and MRD positivity, we're still not sure whether transplant will help in these patients. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
That was very comprehensive, Venkat. Thank you very much. And really, you have set the stage for what we should be doing for risk stratification. The essence I can gather is, when you see your a child on day 1, make sure that all the samples are sent for karyotyping. The sample is sent for FISH. A sample is kept for molecular analysis. If every comprehensive panel can't be done, at least FLT3, because whether it's positive or negative is going to alter how you treat them. So then you start the treatment. Whatever treatment you do, you give it with optimal supportive care. At the end of the first and second cycles, assess how they are responding to your treatment in terms of, are they going into remission, or are they MRD positive or negative, and then make your further plan of action. This is so different to ALL, because here all of these components are important, because we are spending a lot of time, effort, and money with the supportive care in AML, and we don't get second chances. So what we do first time should be comprehensive, and assessment on day 1 and at the end of the first treatment cycle treatment is really important for these children. So thank you. And just with this background, I want to call upon Ramya to give her thoughts on the case 1 versus case 2. So we have somebody with good parameters, another person with adverse parameters in terms of both cytogenetics, molecular, and MRD. So what would be your recommendations on which child you will just continue with chemo, or you're going to suggest upfront transplant?
Thank you, ma'am. So if we can just go back to, if all of us can just think back about what Keshav just said about the two cases. The first child, both are similar age, both adolescents. The first child presented with a translocation 821, both AML M2. So the first child had translocation 821 and he became MRD negative at the end of induction. The second child, again AML M2, had FLT3 positive and was not MRD negative at the end of induction. And she required a salvage chemotherapy to get her into MRD negative status. So that sets the stage for what are the indications for transplant. As Sir said, as Venkat Sir just said, it's very evolving. It's changing by the month, I think, and not just the year. And as we find out more and more mutations, people are doing more studies on what is high risk and what is not. So things are evolving. But as on now, based on the EBMT 2019 guidelines, next slide please, ma'am. It is known that in AML, there is a very good graft versus leukemia effect, which means that your donor cells will give a good fight against the patient's recipient leukemic cells, thereby maintaining them in remission and preventing relapse. So, however, over years, you know that you want to decrease transplant-related mortality and you want them to have better survival. So, where do you transplant, where do you not? Again, this is a big list, very much evolving. These kind of patients with any of these are at the moment considered high risk and recommended to undergo transplant in CR1. Next slide, please. And FLT3 ITD is very evolving. Most will consider FLT3 ITD to be high risk. However, there are some where it may be considered to be good risk and where they look at the allelic ratio, like Sir just said, if it's more than 0.4, to be considered to be higher risk. Again, development of next generation FLT3 inhibitors, which we all know is midostaurin, may change this outlook, but as on today, it is considered to be high risk. The second important point to consider for transplant is minimal residual disease. So as per EBMT 2019, an MRD cutoff of 0.1% at time course 2, which means at the end of induction, is an indication to put them in the high risk and consider transplant. In relapsed AML, there is no question. Here, there is a definite indication to proceed with transplant because there is definitely a survival advantage, especially because of the GBL effect. Yeah, I think that's all for the indications.
Yeah, thanks, Ramya. I think the big difference is why can't we offer transplant for everyone and only for a few select cases, because we are very much worried about transplant related immediate mortality. I mean, AML chemotherapy itself is challenging, whereas transplant, you have the additional immune effect as well with graft versus host disease. And also we always worry about fertility in children. So you have to choose the patients that you're going to transplant very carefully, and thank you for the recommendations on those whom we would consider high risk. What would you do to treat them and prevent a relapse? So,
And, Madam, can I ask a question, Madam?
Yeah.
Madam, so this intermediate risk group, normal cytogenetics, no NPM1, FLT3. So our data has shown that they don't do as well as your good risk, 30 to 40%. So in this group, sometimes in our transplant board, there's always an argument whether to take them for transplant or not. It is easier if they have a sibling transplant, but some people say, no, they should be taken for haplo, but again in infection. So what is your practice for this group of patients, your normal cytogenetics, intermediate risk group? For transplant?
Very good question, Venkat. I think I didn't realize the answer to this until one day I read this, the AML COG paper by Dr. Pui, and we usually associate St. Jude's with all the ALL trials, but they had a very a good revelation in their two trials in the 90s and in the 2000s, and they said that the drugs hadn't changed at all, but their outcomes had increased from 50% to 71%. What had changed was the supportive care, the way they had delivered the treatment. So I think our problem is not with the risk stratification here. It's mainly in our country with the way we deliver the treatment, because our children come in quite sick. They're not maybe by day 7, if we want to give 3+7, by the 3rd day they are very ill. We delay the donomycin, we are delaying some chemotherapy. So maybe it's difficult to compare that. And there was also a question in the chat box to say, why don't our 821s do as well as what Western literature is saying? I think we need to augment our supportive care strategies, and only then we're going to see results on par with the West. And this is where I think the challenge lies, that risk stratification, we should follow guidelines and say that if they are a good risk not to transplant, and high risk, go straight for transplant. Intermediate risk, weigh the balance between relapse and the transplant related mortality carefully, because intermediate risk child who is normal cytogenetics, normal molecular FLT3 negative, to offer haplo at this point, I think that upfront would be wrong. But if they relapse, there's no question. So I think we should do the risk benefit analysis, and with the present data, there is no indication to transplant. So Siddharth, if you can share your experience on multi-drug resistant infection in children undergoing AML treatment, please.
Thank you, ma'am. So Dr. Ram described the various microbiological aspects of multi-drug resistant organisms. So what I'm going to do is describe to you how those organisms affect us at the bedside through the experience that we have had in CMC. So I'm presenting the data of our children with non-M3 AML who were treated in the last 3 years, between 2017 to 19. We treated 37 children, and we treat children up to 15 years at our center. And we ensure that every child has a vascular access device placed prior to induction. Most of them undergo a PICC line placement. The next commonest one is a chemoport device. So when we talk about MDR organisms, next slide, please. So the commonest MDR organisms that we encounter, we can remember by the mnemonic ESCAPE, because these are the organisms we want our children to escape from, including Enterococcus, Staphylococcus, Klebsiella, Acinetobacter, Pseudomonas, and Enterococcus. So these are organisms which are resistant to at least one agent in 3 categories. So why do we talk about MDR and AML specially? So if you see the survival curves at our center, overall survival was around 59%, but if I excluded the infectious deaths, the survival was better by 10%. So that is why it is important to talk about MDR infections. Next slide. So we encountered MDR infection in almost half of our patients with AML, and it is alarming that 1/4 of our patients died or were discharged in a critical condition from which they were unlikely to recover during the induction, that is before they achieved remission, and almost all of them had MDR sepsis. And almost half our patients required an ICU admission, and most of those patients who went to the ICU had MDR infections. And again, most of the infections which were documented in our patients with AML were MDR infections. So it's a huge problem. Next slide. So if we see which were the MDR organisms we encountered, 70% of these organisms were CRO, Klebsiella, and E. coli, which were resistant to carbapenems, beta-lactams, and aminoglycosides, which form the first and second line antibiotics in most of the centers. And these were sensitive only to TG cycline or colistin. And the other organisms which we encountered were vancomycin-resistant Enterococcus, Ralstonia, and Acinetobacter, the latter two being intrinsically resistant to most of the common antibiotics. Next. And the other organisms which are non-MDRO included ESBL, Klebsiella, E. coli, Pseudomonas, cons, and methicillin-sensitive Staph aureus. Next slide. So this is just a busy slide, but what I want to show from this table is that when you're treating a child with AML, it means that almost after every course of chemotherapy, we are going to witness bad febrile neutropenias, requirement of second line and often third line antibiotics, particularly in the first induction. And we are talking about a long duration of antibiotic treatment. Next. So just translating all these numbers into words, I don't have time to present a literature review, but in 2014, most of the centers published their data of infections in Indian Journal of Cancer. And I can tell you that I'm talking for all the centers which had published their data, that MDR infections occur in almost half the children with AML during treatment, and sepsis kills almost 1 in 4 children before they attain remission. And interestingly, most of the infections in AML are gut related, and most of the ICU stay is because of these MDR infections. And not only mortality, MDR infection translates into prolonged hospitalization and cost, which is very important in our setup. So what is the connection between the gut and MDR in AML? So a fecal microbiota study, which was done in patients with AML, showed that the microbial diversity in the gut significantly decreases with the induction chemotherapy. And as this diversity comes down, there is an increased risk of sepsis. And there is a vicious cycle wherein when you use antibiotics in induction, the diversity further comes down, and this is going to further increase the sepsis and the use of antibiotics. And another very important study from Adyar, Dr. Venkat is there in the panel. So this showed that almost 56% of children with acute leukemia were already colonized with MDRs at the time of diagnosis before we started chemotherapy, and 50% of these organisms were multi-drug resistant, commonest being E. coli, Klebsiella, and Enterococcus. And when they went on to develop febrile neutropenia, there was a 60% concordance between the blood culture and the initial stool culture. Next slide. There was also a study from Tata published in 2014 where they studied almost 600 children with cancer, and again the diagnostic stool culture was infected with multi-drug resistant organisms, which means that multi-drug organisms are out there in the community because of rampant misuse of antibiotics in the general practice, as well as the rampant use in poultry, agriculture, and the cattle industry. So how to tackle these infections? So I've coined this NESA approach, which includes the first thing is nursing care. Please remember, in the war against infections, your commander-in-chief is your nurse. So please empower your nurse. We need to educate them. We need to include them in our rounds and our teaching sessions, and it will definitely reward us. And regarding antimicrobials, we need to have a stewardship program where our antibiotic use and decisions are documented and reviewed from time to time, including microbial audits. And based on this, there should be a dynamic antibiotic policy where we don't stick to the same antibiotics for years together. We keep changing them based on the prevailing antibiotic susceptibility spectrum. And what is the role of antibiotic prophylaxis? Recently, IDSA has published a guideline for immunocompromised children. There is a low-grade evidence for using levofloxacin prophylaxis in AML and relapsed ALL. The advantage is that bacteremia definitely comes down, but the caveat to this is that there may be a risk of increasing resistance strains, and the randomized trial which showed the benefit of levofloxacin could not prove a decrease in mortality. And we also need to do studies to prospectively evaluate if those patients who have the multi-drug organism colonization upfront will benefit with a de-escalation approach, wherein we start off with colistin upfront when febrile neutropenia occurs and then de-escalate based on the clinical stability and the microbial culture data. And of course, the last but not least, aggressive supportive care. So you really need to think out of the box, and anything which can give possibly benefit and where you can follow the policy of primum non ser is fine. So all these interventions might not have any proven benefit, but we use in CMC, we give PEG-GCSF after every cycle of chemotherapy. We give IVIG 0.4 gram per kg after every cycle. And in profoundly neutropenic patients, we also give them granulocyte transfusions, and Buffy-Coat is a cheaper alternative to granulocyte transfusions because we know that neutrophil counts are the game changers when it comes to management of febrile neutropenia. And just to touch upon tuberculosis with relevance to case 1 presented by Dr. Keshavan, we have to remember that in our country, TB is endemic and the treatment coverage is very poor. Therefore, every child with cancer is potentially having a latent infection, which could be unmasked by the profoundly immunosuppressive treatment that you're going to administer. And when we talk about the syndrome of fever, reticulonodular shadows, and lymphadenopathy, which typically is seen in TB, this is also commonly seen in a child presenting with acute leukemia and also during the treatment of febrile neutropenia. And therefore, we need to have a high index of suspicion. We know MANTO is not reliable. Always we should try to do a BAL or a biopsy and prove TB, prove or disprove TB, and gene expert should always be sent other than cultures. What is the concern when we treat TB in a child with cancer on chemotherapy? One is additive toxicity, particularly hepatotoxicity. And the second thing is rifampicin being a cytochrome enzyme inducer. We are worried that it might lead to compromise of the efficacy of the chemotherapy drugs. Second slide. There is one good study published from the PJ Hematology Department. So from this, we can see that most of the hematological malignancies which had TB were AML patients. And most of these patients who had TB required therapy modifications like changing the drugs, delay in therapy, and so on. And patients with AML who had TB were more likely to be disseminated and extrapulmonary, just like we saw in the case which was presented. And most of the patients who died due to TB during treatment were patients with AML. So summarizing, TB is seen more common in hematological malignancies. Outcomes are poor, but it seems that ATT is tolerated quite well by patients while on chemotherapy. And one thought is that if there is a problem with ATT, rifampicin, leading to poor tolerance or concern of loss of efficacy, can be replaced by levofloxacin.
Thank you, Siddharth. I love that you brought the NASA in to face the challenge of multi-drug resistant bacteria, and also touched upon, it is very peculiar that we have ALL children on prolonged steroids, but the incidence of TB in our country with ALL chemotherapy is not as high. So this is something that is underreported and we should always watch for. So when we are treating these children, we are watching for definitely multi-drug resistant bacteria, and going back to basics, surface cleaning, hand washing, training our nursing team, looking after central lines. And one thing that has not been touched upon, but I want to tell for the juniors, if you see E. coli, Pseudomonas klebsiella, it's come from the child's own gut. If you're culturing Acinetobacter, Ralstonia, they have all, and Strenotrophomonas, they are water bugs. They are sticky water bugs, and they have come through the environment. And if you see such infections, certainly we have to go back to central line training for our nurses, because it's come from the environment. It's come from our hands. So we have to make sure that at least we can reduce morbidity by avoiding these infections. And what we found is that the perianal region is the big focus of infections in our patients. So I want to call upon Ramya now to talk about the AML infections in our setup, because your approach has been slightly different to what we have done. Somebody had asked, why did you do stool carba-R? What are you doing with the infections, and what is the role of granulocytes in this situation? So I'm just going to go and complete this infections, AML infection data from Ramya, because we have lack of time. We have only 10 more minutes. If we have time, we will come back to data. What is the difference between adult and pediatric?
Thank you, ma'am. So this is just an auditing that we did and a self-analysis of our own data to look at what were the infection spectrum in the children with AML who are undergoing chemotherapy. So the reason behind this analysis was that in 2012, we noticed that there was a significant increase in the, suddenly there were a lot of isolates which were gram-negative and multi-drug resistant. So therefore we decided to analyze this, and we had data for over 18 years from 2002 to 2019. Next slide, please. So all children who were less than 18 years of age and diagnosed to have AML were included in this study. The total was 48, the total number of children included, and within the entire 18 years spectrum, 64% of the children had culture positive bacteremia, out of which 80% was GNB and only 20% was GPC. Next slide, please. And among the GNBs, 72%, so predominantly we had isolated was Klebsiella pneumoniae, followed by E. coli, and only one, a small percentage, 4% had Pseudomonas, and only one child did have Vibrio cholerae. And among the GPCs, Streptococcus viridans was the most common. So carbapenem resistance was noticed. This was a little bit surprising. When we were analyzing this, we thought Klebsiella would be the maximum with the carbapenem resistance. However, even though the numbers were larger in the Klebsiella, over 60% of these were carbapenem resistance, but in the E. coli, almost 90% were carba resistant. And ma'am just mentioned about the gut being the focus, and that was found to be the focus in 83% of the children. And perianal ulcers, what we mean by ulcers is either perianal excoriation or the presence of significant symptoms of mucositis in that area was seen in almost 64%. And we did find a significant correlation between those who had these significant ulcers and the development of JNB bacteremia. Next slide, please. So between 2012 and after 2012, so we had divided the study in these two eras. The percentage of culture positive sepsis has been almost the same, not very much increased, 52 to 72%. However, the carba resistance has gone up from 14% to 67% to after 2012, and this again had a significant statistical value. And so based on all this analysis, there are several interventions, like Dr. Siddharth just mentioned, that are important to prevent this from happening. So perianal hygiene, extremely important. We use this barrier cream of lanolin ointment. It comes as something called nip care, which is basically used by women for their cracked nipples. And one of the mothers was using it, and then we thought, let's use it for the child, and it worked brilliantly. And that is alternated with this triple cream, which is basically a mixture of clotrimazole, mupirocin, and zinc. Sitz bath is done at least twice a day in these children. And mucositis, we know, is universal. So neutropenic diet is very, very semi-elemental, double-boiled food and protein supplements. And avoiding tunneled lines, central lines, as Sir has, Dr. Ram Gopal Krishnan already said, remove them as soon as you think there is sepsis before septic shock. Granulocyte transfusions, next slide please. The use of these early makes a difference, and this we have published earlier also, that they have decreased the mortality when used early. Next slide please. Definitely, like Sir said, calling your friendly ID consultant makes a very big difference. Taking them in the loop and taking their advice on what has to be done, antibiotic stewardship, the hospital infection control policies, empowering not just nurses but the parents as well on what has to be done for the child. Next slide please. So the overall survival in our cohort was 53%. Next slide. And the predominant cause of death has been disease relapse, as has been shown the world over. So a good, touchwood, heartening thing, and something that we should probably improve even further, was that the induction sepsis rate, in spite of all the increase in CABA resistance and over 18 years, has remained at 6.2%. And this right slide just shows that those who were transplanted after relapse did have a significant survival advantage. So therefore, those who relapse, definitely transplant is indicated. Yeah.
So thanks, Ramya. I think we have another 3-4 minutes to conclude our session. And I just want to point out a few salient points from all the discussions we've had so far. AML in children is curable. Maybe Siddharth can spend just a couple of minutes on telling how childhood AML is different to adult AML, and then we can conclude the session. Siddharth, please.
Could I have that slide, ma'am?
Okay, 1 second. This one?
Yeah. So to differentiate pediatric and adult AML, the first thing is that the nature of malignancy, almost always it is a primary disease in children. Very rarely when you have a child, say somebody like a Fanconi anemia may have a background of MDS developing into AML. Unlike in adults, where up to 20% the AML arises in the background of MDS. Then coming to the karyotype, in infants, 50% of them have the MLL rearrangement, currently called the KMT2A rearrangement. And translocation 122 in infants, something specifically seen only in babies. And in the older children, we have this core binding factor AML, that is 821 inversion 6, which is much more common than what we see in adults. Monosomal karyotypes are more common in adults, which carry poor prognosis. Then in the normal karyotype AML, genetic aberrations like NPM, CBPA, as well as the poor prognostic FLT3 are all less common in children compared to adults. Isolated myeloid sarcoma presentation is slightly more common in children compared to adults. Next slide. Coming to the treatment aspects, when we have a child with AML, our intent is always curative. Whereas in an adult, depending upon age or a comorbidity or performance status, the intent may or may not be curative. And again, the treatment protocol in children is usually 2 courses of induction followed by 2 to 3 courses of consolidation, and is predominantly based on a trial. Whereas in adults, it is largely individualized, and it is more often not a trial-based treatment. And the CNS carries importance in children. We always assess at baseline, we at least get a CSF done, and we address positivity with at least multiple intrathecal to achieve a CSF negativity. Sometimes cranial artery has also been used, whereas in adults, CNS is not routinely assessed or addressed. And bone marrow transplant in first CR is not something still well established in children, whereas in adults in the first CR, BMT is much more commonly offered. And finally, survival is definitely much better in childhood AML compared to adults.
Thanks, everyone. I think you summarized the difference between adults and children beautifully. So I want to end this session by saying that it's a big learning experience. You can see every decade has shown improvements in AML survival. It's good to focus on our AML children because the entire quality of care goes up in your pediatric oncology unit. Because if you can treat AML induction or deliver care for an AML child, then the rest of the support services also improve, and transplant services, everything improves, and people learn to work as a team. And AML therapy cannot be done by an individual. As Siddharth said, we need nursing, we need good microbiology, hospital infection control, blood donors, and we need good risk stratification at the beginning. So we can't cut corners and say they are poor and we didn't do karyotyping, we didn't get fish or molecular, because it's important for us to know how to treat these children. And we're going to spend a lot of money in the supportive care. We have to make sure that the families understand the financial implications, because a lot of money is required within a short span of time. In no other condition you need so much at such short span of time. And choose the children that need referral for transplant really carefully, not for everyone, and it may be very few, but choose them carefully, and they need follow-up so that the outcomes can be as good as it is for the childhood ALL children. So thank you very much. And if there are one or two questions, Sunil, if we can take.
Yes, I'm sure we can take one or two questions, not a problem. I think we're still on time.
I think Venkat sir had answered, but a general thing on what antifungal prophylaxis.
Yeah, we didn't touch much upon antifungal, because I think that is a whole new complete session that we could have, because we were told to focus on one or two aspects of a condition. So we chose to do risk stratification and bacterial infection. Maybe we'll come back some other time, but it depends on where your focus is. Predominantly, if you're having gut focus and enterocolitis, you choose something to cover Candida. If there is building construction work and chest symptoms, you would cover Aspergillus. So the antifungal prophylaxis and treatment, always we need to have high index of suspicion for Aspergillus, image them early, do CT scans early, and start the liposomal amphotericin if there is any suspicion of clinical suspicion of Aspergillus, because we can't wait until it progresses. That is the gist of it. Anything else?
Madam, would you prefer a 2-drug or a 3-drug induction? Some centers
That
in India
again,
use the 2-drug.
a lot of studies have been. Yeah. So, is there any value of adding etoposide? What is the role of anthracyclines in induction? So, a lot of studies have come. So, you can see that in the UK itself that they have knocked off etoposide in the current trial. So, they're using only a combination of mitoxantrone and cytarabine for induction. The etoposide is very gut toxic. So if we have predominantly gut-based bacteria in our country, maybe it is a good time to think about eliminating etoposide. But if we eliminate etoposide and use only the 3+7 backbone, maybe our outcomes won't be that good. In the UK, they use mitoxantrone, and mitoxantrone is a drug that goes right down to the leukemic stem cell. But the problem of using mitoxantrone is it causes quite prolonged neutropenia. So you'll need to be able to support children for 5 to 6 weeks. And we all know that by day 10 post-chemotherapy, we are literally holding our hearts in our hands, because every day matters for these children. So I think at the moment for our country, maybe for most units, a 3+7 delivered well with supportive care. If we are losing 25% of our children due to sepsis, then maybe the third drug is something we need to knock off. There was a good article from Pakistan regarding this discussion, whether the third drug is important or not. And they clearly showed that the sepsis mortality came down when they knocked off etoposide. So it depends on the supportive care you can provide.
Venkat, I guess you are doing one randomization between 2 and 3 drugs. So you have any inputs on that? Any initial results?
We are just collecting the data, so probably in a year's time we should be able to tell you.
Sunil, I see Chintan has raised a hand. What is his question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, Chintan.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Very good afternoon, Dr. Revati and all the participants. Just only one question in our Indian setting, role of pre-treatment swabs, rectal swabs for isolation, decontamination.
Comment on that. I didn't touch upon much, but that was part of a study because we were looking at what is the rate of multi-drug resistant bacterial infection in the community. So we did it for about a 4-year period, and to our shock and horror found that the majority of the kids came in with these NDM and OXA-Rs in their stool, even when they've just been never been to a hospital, or sometimes when they've been in the hospital within the second week. First week they may be stool Carba-R negative, and the second week they become positive. So it was part of a study, and as Ram said, now we have moved away from stool Carba-R screening to doing blood Carba-R when we pick up the gram-negative bacilli, because that guides our therapy.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you very much.
Thanks. We can end, Sunil. I think. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for the amazing panelists, Venkat, Siddharth, Ramya, and Ram. I think Ram had to leave because there is a lot of pressure for them during the COVID season. And thank you, PHO and Sunil, for the opportunity. If there are questions on the chat box, we'll continue answering them. Yeah.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you. It was, I think, very relevant, very common topic discussed today. And I think we had good insights, especially from the ID specialists from your center. So thank you all. Thank you panelists for spending your time with the students today, and we'll see you again next Thursday.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.